I had a photography business, a Christmas tree business, a shoe business, all complete disasters. I was starting a business because I wanted to have control of my own destiny. As soon as somebody else has a stake in your business, they have a right to a say in how it's run. And I just didn't want that. We had 9 million quid's worth of stock in women's and children's clothes that nobody wanted to buy. And the business very, very nearly went bust again. There have been very few governments in my lifetime where the rhetoric matches reality. Politicians very rarely come from a business background. I think it's well publicized this government have not had business experience. The world is what it is. I've got to make the most of it. There's no point whinging about what the government are doing or not doing because they're not going to change.
Yeah.
Oh God, what was I thinking? I've often asked myself, what was I thinking? Why did I think it was going to be different this time?
Now, in this episode of the Editor's Interview at City AM, I am joined by Nick Charles Tyrwhitt Wheeler. And that Charles Tyrwhitt is not in quote marks, that is his middle name and the name of the business he founded back in 1986. Now, first things first, hand on my heart, this is a pure coincidence because I don't tend to check my labels, but I did notice this morning that I am wearing an appropriately labelled jacket.
I actually noticed when I walked in this morning, you were an incredibly well-dressed young man.
Ah,
Yeah,
well, that's very nice of you to say. I particularly appreciate the young reference, but it's one of my favourite jackets.
Smart, isn't it?
And I have to say, I think I probably had it for about 7 years. So credit to you.
It's good you're wearing that because a lot of people think of us as just being work shirts, and we do a hell of a lot more than that. So it's nice that you're wearing it, and you've commented on it.
Well, there you go. Okay. Well, that's enough of the advertising. We'll move on. Charles Tyrwhitt. I'd say nobody in the city, but I'm sure, obviously, of course, it goes far wider than that. People are very familiar with you as a physical presence, no less, on high streets. I believe you started this business from your student digs in Bristol in the 80s.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that all came to be.
I think I was a sort of slightly strange student. Most people, I think, go off to university to drink a lot and do very little work. I was quite keen on the very little work and actually quite keen on the drinking a lot, but I always wanted to have my own business. And when I was at school, I had little businesses and I was always looking for things to do, sort of ducking and diving. I knew I was going to have my own business later on in life. I just didn't know what it was going to be. So I tried lots of things. And I think university is good for different people in different ways. And it was good for me because it gave me an umbrella of sort of respectability to try funny little businesses. So, my father didn't give me a hard time for wasting time because I was doing a degree. But
So it gave you cover.
It gave me cover. And it meant I could experiment. Once you leave university, you say, I'm going to start my own business. You're out there and you've got to get on with it. But I was sort of hidden away, and I tried lots of different things. I had a photography business, a Christmas tree business, a shoe business, all complete disasters. And then I thought, well, when the shoes didn't work, I thought, what can I do instead of shoes? And I went for shirts.
And what was the first model of the business? How did it start to operate? What were the first few years like?
The first few years, I think everyone thought it was a bit of a joke. People sort of. They couldn't see it working. There's nothing clever about starting a shirt business. I think Michael Dell started Dell in 1984, which was 2 years before me. Charles Dunstan started Carphone Warehouse in 1988, 2 years after me. They were both quite clever businesses. Portable computers were taking off, mobile phones were taking off, the market was doing that. I think doing shirts was just, not a clever thing. But I just wanted I wanted a product that I understood. And I wanted a product, I always knew, everybody said, when you start a business, and it applies today, people say, you start a business, first thing you've got to do is go out and get investment. I always knew I didn't want investment. I was starting a business because I wanted to have control of my own destiny. And as soon as you get investment, as soon as somebody else has a stake in your business, they have a right to a say in how it's run. And I just didn't want that. So, I thought I'm going to start a business. I'm going to do it very, very slowly. I'm going to take a long time. And this is people saying, look, you've got to make a decision. You can have a large slice of a small pie, which is what you're going to end up with if you just self-fund and grow it very slowly, or you have a small slice of a large pie. Everybody with the innuendo that it was good to have a large pie. And I've always been a greedy little thing, but I always quite like the idea of having a large slice of a large pie. And if it took me 100 years, if I was still alive in 100 years, that was fine with me.
I've read that you've given that advice at a few opportunities about whether to take on external investment. And I think reasonably recently you were asked it in the context of Dragon's Den. And Dragon's Den has got a lot to answer for better and for worse, on our sort of entrepreneurial culture and the way people think about businesses and starting businesses and what you have to do and the hoops you have to go through. And you've been quite adamant, and you've just reiterated it now, that it's not absolutely essential to give away 20% to get some seed funding, etc. I mean, obviously, it's a huge part of business ecosystem, different forms of investment, VC, etc. It's obviously a huge part. But your point really, I suppose, is that it's not right for everybody. It's not a given that you need to go out and find that.
I think it's definitely not right for everybody. I think actually the people who are prepared to do what I've done are quite few and far between. A lot of people say to me, how the hell can you get out of bed every morning for 38 years saying, whoopee, today I'm going to sell a few shirts? You only live once. You surely want to do something else. And I think that, which is very valid. And also I think there are businesses where you can't do that. I started a shirt business, and there are people who started shirt businesses in 1900, in 1986 when I did. There are people who started them in 2000, and this year there are people starting shirt businesses. You can start a shirt business. Shirts, it's not a high-tech business. If you've got an amazing high-tech business idea, you can't do what I've done, because someone will come along and they will see what you're doing and they will do it better, faster, quicker. They'll develop it faster, and you'll get left behind. You won't have a chance. So it rather depends on what the product you're doing is, and there aren't that many products that are, or not that many businesses that are so sort of, I basically call it, I would call it basic. A basic business. Selling shirts is a basic business. And you can do it, and you can do it very, very slowly, and you can do it ultimately very, very well, but it takes a long time. But I think most people, don't want to spend the time doing it. They want variety in life. I get that completely. Or they want to go into an industry where you just can't do it because people will come along and take you out.
Well, we'll get on to present day, where you've got more than 50 stores, more than 1,000 people working for you, turnover in the hundreds of millions. But we'll just take our time to get there, because it's not all been plain sailing, I'm assuming, and indeed I've read. Something happened in the mid-90s that I'm assuming was a reasonably formative lesson. What happened?
I think the mid-90s, it was 1994. I finally got to that stage. I started in 86. I left university in 87. I went to work at Bain for 2 years in 89, and the business had done £12,000 a year for the first 4 years. So when I said to people, I'm going into this business full time, everybody said, you're absolutely mad. But I thought, no, it's going to work. There was no reason to think that, and there was nothing clever in thinking that. I felt in my heart. I can't really explain it, but it's a sort of an entrepreneur's thing. You just have you believe. It's a bit of belief. So I believed it was going to work. Nobody thought it would work. But, so 1989, I went full time. And by 1994, I'd got it to this position. I think we were doing £2.5 million sales, making £250,000 profit, which is, a lot of money now. It was even more money then. It was, I was doing better than most of my friends who'd left university before. They were all very surprised. And I made this huge mistake. I've sort of always said it's important to focus, to decide what you're good at and do that. If you have one thing to do, it's easier to do one thing well than to do two things. If you do two things, you're going to do them worse. And in 1994, I had a friend of mine who came to me, and he had a children's clothing business, a children's retail business. They had 5 children's shops. And I'd built a little business doing well, selling shirts to men by mail order. And quite what I was thinking, that it would be a good idea to buy a chain of 5 children's clothes shops, selling children's clothes to usually young mothers, completely different market, completely different, mail order against retail, no similarity at all. And I bought it, and I lost more money in 3 months than I'd made in the last 3 years, and went bust. So that was a bit of a shock to the system.
So how did you rebuild from there?
I bought the business back for about £250,000, with the help for which I will be forever grateful from my father, who remortgaged his house and lent me the money. quite how he had the faith in me, but anyway, he did. And off I went again. And it's sort of, I remember this lesson. I think it's very easy. People will always tell you when you're running your own business, people will give you advice. But listening to advice and actually finding out firsthand, making that mistake yourself, are two very, very different things. So having made that mistake myself, that focus is important, I thought, right, I'm going to focus on the business. I'm going to focus on selling men's shirts to men by mail order. And so round the clock forward, off we went for another 10 years. 10 years later, I'd got it from 2.5 million to 40 million sales. This is 2005, making £4 million profit. So this was a great business. And at that point, I decided that for a while, basically I'm an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is not, I always think the only thing you have to do as an entrepreneur is to decide who is the right person to run my business. Some entrepreneurs can carry on doing it forever, very, very few. But there comes a point when a lot of entrepreneurs will hit a glass ceiling. They think they're the best person, they can't hand over, and the business stops growing. I wasn't the right person to run this business. So I brought somebody in. He came from Ralph Lauren, lovely guy. And we sat down and we talked about the strategy for the business. And he said, look, I think you should do women's and children's clothes. Now, looking back, I can see how ridiculously stupid I was to think that I could sell children's clothes again 10 years later. That you make the same mistake twice, it's not going to end up with a different result. And it didn't. A year later, we went from making £4 million a year to making nothing. We had 9 million quid's worth of stock in women's and children's clothes that nobody wanted to buy. And the business very, very nearly went bust again. So that was those two mistakes were pretty horrendous. And they taught me that, stick to the knitting, all the old cliches, focus, focus, focus. And that's sort of really what I've tried to do, but definitely not plain sailing.
What was it then, that period where you decided, I'm going to diversify again? You had built a business that was growing, that, as you put it, selling men's shirts to men.
Yep.
Appreciate, there's more in a wardrobe than that.
Yeah.
But can you look back at that and think, well, I didn't get it right first time round moving into children's clothes or another line, but this time it's different. Why do you think you took
You mean this time in terms of broadening the product range to men?
No, to
the second time.
The second time round. Yeah.
Oh God! What was I thinking? I've often asked myself, what was I thinking? Why did I think it was going to be different this time? And I think I've always really admired Ralph Lauren as a business. I think he just is it's an incredible business story. And I think there's a little piece of me that sort of wanted to be Ralph Lauren. And so when I recruited this guy, he came from Ralph Lauren, and he said, look, we can make you into the new Ralph Lauren. And I think I was blinded by the idea of being the new Ralph Lauren. And it was, 10 years is a long time. I'd sort of forgotten the lesson, which again is an important lesson, because that was now 20 years ago. And I hope I'm not going to forget that lesson again. I think you can forget a lesson once. I say to people when they join the business, look, this is a business. If you make a mistake, that's absolutely fine. But just learn from it and move on. Now I have to say, look, it's fine to make the same mistake twice, but just don't make it 3 times. But why did I do it? Why did I think it was going to be different? I wish I could answer that question. And it'd be interesting to see where the business would be now if I hadn't made that mistake a second time round. Because one thing it did do is it reinforced my belief that, Charles Tyrwhitt is a business that's going to sell clothing to men. We are going to make it easy for men to dress well.
And so you've been going now for decades.
Yeah,
you've had your learning moments. I'm sure there are many.
Yeah.
What remains as true now as it was when you sold your first shirt in 1986? For all those ups and downs, and we'll come on to some of the bigger downs, whether that's pandemics or whatever it might be. But throughout the main sort of narrative arc of your business, what's been the constant? Maybe it's something you only identify in hindsight, but what's as true now as it was when you started?
I think the constant is there are some very simple business rules that I think that every business should stick to. And actually a surprising number of businesses don't stick to. And I think that's why a lot of businesses get into trouble along the way. But they are, and it's very simple. It's quality, value, service. So just sell a good quality product, good value for money, and offer great service. And I think that I've always believed that right from the beginning. I thought I want to offer, a better shirt at a better price, and I want to give great service. I will bend over backwards for the customers. And I've done that literally from day one. And then I think subsequent to that, I've sort of added on to that, and I always say to people, look, I want Charles Tyrwhitt to be a great business. And they say, well, what is a great business? What's the definition of a great business? And some people will say, it's a big business, or it's a profitable business, and I think a great business is, it's a business where the people who work in the business love working in the business, where the customers love the business, which is where the service comes in, and where the suppliers love the business. And in a way now, I don't run the business now. I have a chief exec who's fantastic, much better than I ever was. But I have those real beliefs that I want the people. The thing that I love doing is if I walk into the store down here now, if I walk into the store and somebody says to me, I love working in this business, I just have to say, I love working here. That's what really makes a difference to me. Or a customer comes in and says, gosh, you're Nick Wheeler. Gosh, I absolutely love the shirt. I love your shirts. And I think that's the basis for a great business. And I think those are the ground rules that you have to have. People have to love working within an organization. If people don't enjoy it, they're not going to do a good job.
Well, I mentioned the word pandemic, and won't surprise you to learn that it, as a free daily business commuting newspaper, it obviously took its toll on us. Can't believe it was 5 years ago. How did it affect your business? And I'm interested in particular as to whether there's the kind of crisis point of impact, but also longer term, perhaps led to some changes that have been beneficial or that you perhaps otherwise wouldn't have made.
Yeah.
So it's not too painful. Let's just talk a bit about how it hit you in the early stages versus how it shapes you now.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, that, because the pandemic was, apart from going bust in 1994, probably the worst day or sequence of days in my life, the beginning of the pandemic. Literally the worst days of my life, because we went from being, I always thought, okay, Michael Dell sold computers, Charles Dunstan sold mobile phones. I wish I'd done those things, but I sold shirts. But the great thing about shirts is that people are always going to need shirts. They're always going to go to work, forevermore. It's a product that is just going to be steady, and I can do this for a long time. I woke up at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody going to work. It was like this is just impossible. And our sales did decline very rapidly. We were very much a formal shirt, tie, suit business, and nobody was buying that product. And I think in a way, from that point of view, it was the worst time of my life. Longer term, it was probably the best thing that could possibly have happened to me, because I think we were a bit like an ostrich with its head in the sand. Dress Down Friday is something that, when did that start? In the 1990s, 1980s probably. There'd been a gradual move. People were dressing down, not just on Fridays. They were being more casual at work, and we were so the general trend was sort of down for that formal wear, and we just weren't. We were doing quite well. We were doing quite a good job of selling shirts, so our sales were going up, but we were going up in a tide that was going out, and so we were under potentializing the business. So the business had started to plateau off. By then we were doing sales of about 200 million, and it was a bit flat. We couldn't really understand why it was flat. And it was flat because we were selling product that our customer didn't want. They'd gone more casual. And in the pandemic, they didn't just go more casual. They just went casual. I mean, they stopped the formal altogether. So it was a damn good kick up the arse that we needed. And subsequent to that, we made some pretty radical changes to the business. And post-COVID, we've had a great time.
And so you can slot the effects of COVID on your business and on your customers' behaviour into a longer story about people's sense of formal wear changing, or fashion changing, or smart casual changing, or the professional, the reality of professional life, particularly for men, which remains your customer base, had been changing.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've got a good sense on how it's changing, how it might change again? Is there any bit of you that's nostalgic for the days where suit and tie was what you wore to work versus what you see now walking around the square mile much more?
I think what happens is that the suit and tie is actually still, it's pretty important. And just recently, there's been increasing movement amongst well-publicized movement amongst some of the big banks and some of the big companies who are just saying, look, you're coming back to the office 5 days a week. So people say to me, you're still selling ties. Does anyone buy a tie? Our ties are double-digit up this year and last year. Suits are double-digit up this year and last year. Big growth in ties and suits. But what it's done, what the pandemic's done with making us realize that actually men don't just want to wear suits and ties, is it's opened up the huge, there is a huge market for menswear outside of that formal. The semi-smart and the casual, and the weekend wear, and got what you wear if you go and play golf, or the market is so much more than just the formal side. And one of the big battles for us is actually, we have a pretty broad range now, and it's making people understand that we sell much more than just shirts and ties and suits. So it's been a very good thing. And I think we've adapted because we had to, because if we hadn't, we would have gone bust again. We've adapted pretty well to it, and we now sell. The range is, I say very broad, but not too broad. I hope not too broad.
Tell us about differences, if there are any, between the UK market and in the US. Where are you in the US market? How many stores do you have operating there at the moment?
We have 14 stores in the US.
Okay. From when was the first?
The first one was in 2001.
Okay, so you've had a footprint there for a
So
while.
we've actually had a footprint for a while. Yeah.
Is it growing more recently?
The US is our biggest market, much bigger than the UK actually. And so the US is a great market for us. I mean, the US is a much bigger market than the UK. So it's sort of, we've been there for nearly 25 years. So it's, well, actually, no, doing the mail order.
Yeah.
We've been there more than 25 years. So we've been there a long time. We've done it, like the rest of the business. We've done it slowly, and it's grown very well. And I think one of the nice things about selling shirts is that you can go pretty much anywhere in the world, and men wear not dissimilar clothing pretty much anywhere in the world. There's a few places where they don't. And the US it's a very different customer. Their mindset is very different, and a lot of retail, well publicized, go to America thinking, oh well, it's just 5 times bigger than the UK. Do what we do in the UK, and it'll work well. But when it comes to the customer themselves, but actually what they wear is quite similar. So that works very well for us because we can sell pretty much the range. We don't do anything special for the US. We might find that they wear more white shirts in the US than they do here. So there's a slight different range in the product they like. Or in Germany, they don't like pink shirts, and different markets have different slight nuances. But basically, we sell the same product range in the US as we do in the UK, and it makes life much easier.
Well, the retail sector is always in the news. It is with us, at least anyway.
Yeah.
And particularly so these days, where, and it's not just the retail sector, but all sorts of businesses facing challenges.
Yeah.
What you might say foreign and domestic.
Yeah.
We've got trade issues, we've got tariff issues. And then closer to home, there's all kinds of twists and turns in government policy, consumer confidence, etc. So we'll just try and unpick a few of those. But how, we'll come on to the sort of UK market, UK's own issues in a moment. How vulnerable do you feel? How exposed are you in any way to the sort of the larger global economic forces? And those forces are often now being shaped by American policy in particular.
Yeah.
Tariffs are concerned, the trade barriers are concerned. Are you having to wargame any scenarios, or?
Yeah, we are wargaming scenarios. I mean, one of the big things for anybody shipping into the US direct, which is what we do, so we ship from our warehouse in Milton Keynes into the US, is we have, the US has a de minimis charge on, and anything under $800 can go into the US duty free. And Trump decided to take that away one day. Then the next day it was absolute chaos. So he then he took it away again. So, but there is a possibility he will say everything going into the US, you pay duty at whatever rate he decides it's going to be, whether it's 200% on French wine or quite what he's going to decide on shirts, I don't know. But that is, US is our biggest market. We do ship everything direct, so we ship it in at retail price. So if we're paying full duty at retail price on products going to the US, that's going to be very, very expensive for us. So we do wargame that, and it's likely that if he did do that, we're looking at building a warehouse in the US and shipping in at shipping in wholesale and then doing all the pick and pack and distribution out of the US, which would be very expensive in many ways, as complexity to the business, because at the moment we have one big warehouse in Milton Keynes, and we can have 500 white shirts and a 16 collar with a 34 sleeve and a single cuff. If you suddenly have to split it across 2 warehouses, you're always going to find that the people in the UK want to buy the stuff that's in the US warehouse. It just becomes, it's complexity, so it's not good for us. But we are wargaming that, and I think tariffs are. I don't think any retail business is going to argue that tariffs are good for them. Whether governments decide that it's better for the overall state of their particular economy is down to it's up for debate. But you're not going to find a retailer who's going to agree that it's a good idea.
No, I suspect not. So you're wargaming that. I wonder. Yeah. I mean, is there any chance that you're forced into making quite substantial logistical operational changes to your business as a result of Trump policy? Is there any chance, perhaps, that in a bit like the way COVID gave you a kick up the arse, that you might look back in 6 or 7 years and say, I can't believe we never had a warehouse in America? Is there any way that might actually come good?
No, that's a really good point, because it is something. At the moment, we don't have that many stores in the US. We have a lot more stores, twice the number of stores in the UK as we do in the US, which is slightly strange. When the US market is 5 times bigger than the UK, you'd think we'd have more stores. Everything else being equal, we should have more stores in the US. We have our logistics company manage a warehouse for us in the US, which handles the store. So for the store stuff, we ship it in, and they manage it for us. But they're slightly bursting at the seams, and that's slightly constraining the number of stores we can open in the US. So, we're sort of saying, hang on a minute, let's not look forward. And this is the great thing about being private. You can look forward 10 years, 20 years. In 20 years' time, I suspect our business in the US will be not just a bit bigger than the UK, it'll be much bigger than the UK. And I suspect we'll have more stores in the US than we will in the UK. So obviously there will come a point when we will need a full-on warehouse in the US. It's just a question of when, because it's a question of how quick the payback is. Right now, the payback is going to be slower than if we did it when we wanted to do it. If we're forced into doing it, now is not quite the right time. But as you say, I think in 20 years' time, if we look back and we do have a warehouse there, we'll think this has been great.
And sticking with the UK again, retail is a sector, hospitality is another. Sectors that that particularly have high rates of employment, particularly employment of young people starting out in their career, or part-time people, have been particularly battered by changes to national insurance. Yeah. And also I hear a lot of people talk about concerns around changes to just the regulation around employment, with the Employment Rights Bill currently being debated. Yeah. Taking those two things separately, or if you like, together, do you feel like the UK is currently fertile or supportive territory for a business like yours? Yeah, I mean, the UK is not alone in having a few issues with their overall balance sheet. The problem is that the UK doesn't have any money, but nor does France, nor does Germany, nor does America, actually. Nobody has any money. And if you're a business, you're trying to make yourself into a better business, you've got to either increase your sales or reduce your costs. And a government's sort of in a fortunate position of being able to, it's sort of easier for them to increase sales. Increase sales is basically putting up taxes. It's easier for them to do that than to reduce costs. In a business, it's quite hard to increase sales because you're in a competitive environment, and you can put the prices up, no problem. But if the customer stops buying, which they're perfectly entitled to do, you've got a problem. I think if the government puts up taxes, there's not a lot you can do about it, other than you start to make changes to your business. And the question is, are you going to end up being a smaller business, generating less tax, or is your customers going to adapt to it and accept that you're going to put your prices up because you've got to pay more? What's going to happen? I mean, no one really knows. But I'd say that it's not easy doing business in the UK. It's not that easy doing business in many other countries in Western Europe either. So it's a sort of, we're sort of all in the same boat together. It's well publicized problems that all these countries have. And I think as a business owner, you've got to be a bit careful, because I always think you can either be in business or you can be in politics. But I think business people who try to go into politics
I think almost without exception, have failed. And equally, politicians going into business, that doesn't really happen either. So it's a sort of different skills.
I suppose it depends what you mean about business. Quite a few of them end up on boards after they've performed their public service.
Yes, no, that's true.
That's a different thing.
It's a different kind of business.
They don't become entrepreneurs necessarily.
They don't become entrepreneurs. They're not at the front end.
And of course,
they're opening doors.
It's the world's most famous businessman has become the world's most famous president. And he's now forcing you to build warehouses you didn't want to build.
He wasn't necessarily a great businessman, but that's up for debate as well, isn't it?
Certainly is, yeah. Well, we had the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, here writing in City AM very recently, and in which he was saying that there is nothing more important to him than economic growth. And he obviously knew his audience via this newspaper, because he said all the right things that you and I would like to hear a Prime Minister say about how there's nothing more important than the private sector, nothing more dynamic than entrepreneurs, nothing more valuable than family businesses. And I went through that article line by line and I thought, well, that's true, but actually you've undermined it by this and you've undermined that by that. So do you feel like this is a government, and it might not be unique to this government, by the way, because politicians are a strange breed, but thinking about this government and its focus on economic growth, does their rhetoric match reality, the reality that you see? Because you will have got a number, you have a number that you wouldn't otherwise have had to calculate about the additional costs on your wage bill, for example. So do you think that rhetoric matches reality at the moment?
I don't think, I mean, there have been very few governments in my lifetime where the rhetoric matches reality. As I said, politicians very rarely come from a business background. I think it's well publicised that this cabinet or this government have not had business experience. But to be fair, the previous government, not many of them had either. They made some pretty unfriendly decisions towards businesses. And I think, it would take you'd have to be, from another planet to think that actually business is the most important thing. It's the only thing that creates the wealth to pay for everything else. It's large business, and in this country there's a lot of small business that creates that wealth. So it's great that Keir Starmer says that business is the most important, but that is just obvious. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. The problem is that how do you help those businesses to grow at a time when your cost base is very, very high? And that's the problem. And when I look at what this government have done and what the last government did, I don't see much help to businesses, actually. And I think that's, you have a choice as a business person. Either you say, right, this is ridiculous, I'm going to go into politics and change it. Or you say, right, I'm in business, the world is what it is, I've got to make the most of it. There's no point whinging about what the government are doing or not doing, because they're not going to change. I've got to get on and make my own decisions in my own business to make sure that this business succeeds. And I think, most good businesses will, touch wood, they'll always succeed. They'll always come through because they will work with whatever the economic environment gives them. The cliche in retail is, I always think when a retailer starts talking about the weather, that's a bad retailer, because the weather has been basically the same. It's been the same forever. You get, sometimes it's a bit less sunny, and sometimes it's a bit colder, and sometimes a bit hotter. When you start blaming the weather, you're losing. They've lost the plot. It's not about the weather. It's, you need to, you should know your business well enough. The weather's going to be variable. You've got to take cost out of the business. You've got to be more efficient. You've got to be more productive. I mean, there's some basic business things that a lot of businesses sort of ignore. And I think that's the same with the macroeconomic picture. You've got to be, it is what it is. We're probably going to get hit because there is no money. And, cutting costs is a big deal at the moment. The concept of it, doing it is rather harder. It's easier said than done. So,
I mean, in tangible terms, are you going to have fewer people working for you in a year than you would otherwise have? Or are you going to have, in absolute terms, a reduction in your headcount across the business?
I think one of the things that came out of, I said with COVID, that COVID was initially the worst time of my life, and latterly probably one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it woke me up as to what was going on in the business. One of the things we did, because we had to, was we had to have a real close look at our business and the number of people we had in the business and what they were all doing. and we had to make some very, very difficult decisions about losing people. So we had 1,000 people when COVID hit. We had to make 250 people redundant. And we went through, and we tried to, it's a hard decision. But ultimately, we lost some people who maybe weren't as productive as they could have been. People who would sort of sit in meetings. I have a bit of an allergy to meetings generally, but sit in meetings and sort of pontificate about things and come out of the meeting having never made decisions. And, it's a tough one. But what we ended up with was 250 less people. So I think now as a business, we're pretty lean. But I think a lot of businesses who weren't forced to, if we hadn't been forced by COVID to do that, we'd still have those 250 people and we'd be a much less efficient business. So I think we were lucky with hindsight going through COVID. But I think there's a lot of businesses who are going through that process now because in a way, the changes to, there's national insurance and all the changes, they're changing the way you can do business, and it's forcing you to make a change, and people will be employing fewer people.
Well, look, it's been fascinating to talk to you, and I'll end on one final question, thinking of perhaps a student watching this maybe in their own student digs now, thinking about starting a business or wondering whether they should start a business versus join a grad scheme or something. What advice would you give now to somebody who feels they want to be an entrepreneur, whether or not they've got the right idea yet? What advice would you give?
I think it's not about the idea. It's about if you feel you want to be an entrepreneur and you're 19 years old and you've never been to a cash and carry, bought a bulk load of Jammy Dodger biscuits and sold them in the playground, or, gone round car washing for your neighbors to make a few bucks, you're probably or possibly not the right person to be a 19-year-old entrepreneur. You've got to be, I think for the right person, it's the best thing in the world. I feel like I started the business 38 years ago. I feel like I've never really done a day's work in my life. And it's probably looking through rose-tinted spectacles. But I feel, I don't feel like I've done a job. I've never got up on Monday morning thinking, oh God, I've got to go to work. I've loved Mondays, I've loved Fridays, I've loved Sundays. But I think I was always sort of hustling. I was sort of one of those slightly annoying hustlers. I had lots of little businesses before I started the shirt business. And I think if you haven't done that, and it doesn't have to be in your blood to be an entrepreneur, because I think, the alternative, you can be an entrepreneur at any stage of your life. It does become harder as you get older, but there are people who started amazing businesses. They go off and they learn their trade in other businesses, and they start a business at 30 or 40 or 50. And they become incredible entrepreneurs. That's perfectly possible. But to do it straight out of school or university, you need to be a hustler. And it's not something you can say, oh, well, I'd like to be an entrepreneur, so I'm going to go and do it. I think that's tough.
All right. A hustler, but a well-dressed hustler.
I hope
perhaps.
so.
All right. Nick, thanks so much for talking to us at City AM. Thank you.
Thank you very much.